A mustang mare frantically paces along the edge of a frozen lake, her foal trapped beneath the ice, struggling for breath. The storm rages around them, with the wind howling through the desolate wilderness. Everyone believed it was too late. However, in the midst of the chaos, a lone rancher, burdened by his own past, arrives just in time to change everything. This is a story of survival, of unexpected bonds, and of the raw power of compassion in the face of death. Prepare yourself for a journey that will challenge everything you understand about courage, hope, and the spirit of a wild mustang. The bitter cold of winter cut through the barren landscape, transforming the once thriving plains into a frozen wasteland. Snow swirled through the air, biting at the exposed skin of any creature daring enough to brave the open fields. Yet there stood Dakota, a proud mustang mare, her breath visible in the icy air as she watched intently while her foal took his first steps. Echo, her newborn foal, was a small and delicate creature, his coat shimmering with frost. His legs, still weak from the strain of birth, trembled beneath him. However, there was an undeniable strength in his eyes, a spark of life that filled Dakota with an overwhelming sense of pride. She had long awaited this moment, the first glimpse of her foal standing on his own. And now it was finally here. She gently nuzzled him, encouraging him to rise once more after each stumble. Her ears twitched as she listened to the distant wind, the sound of an approaching storm echoing on the horizon. It was not the right season for such a fierce storm, yet Dakota knew better than to question the unpredictable forces of nature. She had witnessed many brutal winters before, and this one promised to be no different. She could feel it deep in her bones. The storm was coming, and it was coming fast. With a soft nicker, Dakota stepped back, urging Echo to move. Her heart swelled with emotion as she watched him take his first unsteady steps across the snow-covered ground. The icy earth beneath them was harsh and unyielding, but Dakota was unconcerned. No matter how cruel the world became, she would protect him. Nothing would stand in her way. Echo faltered again, his legs buckling beneath him, and this time he fell forward, sliding across the snow. Dakota reacted instantly, her hooves skidding across the ice as she tried to catch him. However, the foal was moving too quickly for her to reach him in time. She watched in growing horror as he slid closer and closer to the edge of the frozen lake before them. For a brief moment, Dakota froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She had always known of the lake, the fragile ice that covered its surface, the hidden danger it posed. She had seen other horses, both wild and tame, fall victim to the treachery of winter's ice. However, never in her darkest fears had she imagined that her own foal would make the fatal mistake. Echo wobbled again, his tiny hooves scrambling against the slippery surface. He let out a high-pitched whinny, his voice filled with confusion and fear. Dakota's heart pounded violently in her chest. She lunged forward in desperation, but the thin ice beneath Echo cracked with a sharp, deafening sound. Before she could react, the ice gave way, and Echo vanished beneath the freezing waters below. Dakota's breath caught in her throat as the ice sealed over him. Her world narrowed to a single, terrifying thought. Her foal was drowning. In blind panic, she galloped to the edge of the lake, her hooves pounding against the frozen ground. She skidded to a halt, her body trembling with fear as she stared at the spot where he had disappeared. The ice was too thick, too unyielding. She pawed at it frantically, but it refused to break. She could not reach him. The wind howled around her, the storm growing fiercer, the air becoming even colder. Dakota's chest heaved with ragged breaths, her heart racing wildly. She called out, her voice a desperate, anguished cry, "Echo!" But the icy waters had claimed him, and there was nothing she could do. Time stretched on, every second dragging like an eternity. She was alone, surrounded by the vast and merciless wilderness. There was no one to help, no way to reach her foal. Her mind raced, desperately searching for a solution, any solution. Yet all she could do was stand there, helpless, her heart breaking for the tiny life, slipping away beneath the ice. Just when all hope seemed lost, she saw a figure through the swirling snow, distant but approaching fast. A man on horseback approached. Dakota's eyes widened, a flicker of hope igniting within her chest. Was this the help she had prayed for? Could he save her son? The rider came closer, his silhouette growing clearer against the raging storm. He rode a dark horse, moving through the snow with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. His face remained hidden beneath a weather-beaten hat, but there was no mistaking the urgency in his movements. He reined in his horse as he took in the dire situation before him. His eyes scanned the frozen lake before shifting to Dakota, who stood at the edge, frantic and pleading. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, an understanding passed between them, an unspoken communication. Without hesitation, the man dismounted. He grabbed a rope from his saddle and hurried toward the ice. Dakota could hardly believe it. Someone had come. Someone was going to try to save her foal. The snowstorm howled fiercely, as if the sky itself was furious, and the wind bit at their exposed skin. Dakota stood frozen, watching with a mixture of disbelief and hope as the man worked with swift precision. He moved with a sense of purpose, his hand steady and sure despite the raging storm. The biting wind and freezing temperatures did not seem to faze him. Dakota's body trembled, a mixture of cold and the deep anxiety gripping her heart. Her eyes never left the man. She did not know who he was or why he was here, but one thing was certain: he was their only chance. The man surveyed the lake, his eyes narrowing as he examined the crack in the ice where Echo had fallen through. Dakota's desperate calls echoed into the distance, but there was no response from beneath the water. No sound of her foal struggling, no frightened whinnies, only the eerie silence of the storm. "I am coming for you, little one," the man muttered under his breath. With that, he waded through the deep snow, moving towards the edge of the ice. From his saddlebag, he pulled out an axe and began striking the frozen surface. Each powerful swing sent jagged shards scattering across the lake. The ice groaned and splintered under the force of his blows, but he did not stop. His determination was undeniable. Dakota could not comprehend why this stranger would risk his life for a wild foal he had never met. Why would he brave such danger for them? But none of it mattered. Her only focus was Echo. He was out there, trapped beneath the ice, and without help, he would surely die. The man continued to hack at the ice, each strike louder than the last. The storm raged around them, but he remained undeterred, focused only on the task at hand. Dakota stepped closer, her hooves sinking deep into the snow. She watched in tense silence, her heart pounding in her chest as the man fought against time itself. Seconds stretched into minutes, each moment dragging on like an eternity. It felt like a lifetime had passed since Echo had fallen through the ice, and Dakota could only pray that this man's efforts would not be in vain. Then, with a final powerful swing, the ice shattered with a sharp, resounding crack. Without hesitation, the man thrust his hand into the freezing water, gripping the rope that was now secured to a sturdy branch nearby. Dakota's breath caught as she watched him pull with all his strength, struggling against the weight of the frozen lake. A few moments later, a small, trembling body broke through the surface. Echo. His soaked coat clung to his fragile frame, his limbs limp, his head hanging low. He had been trapped beneath the ice for far too long. But the man did not stop. With a final, straining effort, he pulled Echo's tiny body from the lake and onto the snow-covered ground. Dakota's heart skipped a beat, and she rushed forward, her instincts screaming at her to reach her foal. She let out a desperate whinny, nudging him gently, feeling the coldness of his small body beneath her touch. But there was no response. He was unconscious, his breathing faint and shallow. The man, seeing the mare's panic, moved quickly. He grabbed a thick blanket and wrapped it tightly around the foal, trying to warm him as best he could. His voice, rough from the cold, was steady as he spoke. "You are going to be all right." He rubbed his hands over Echo's trembling body. trying to generate some warmth, but the little foal was not responding. Dakota stood by, her eyes fixed on her son. She could feel her own body shaking from the cold, but it was nothing compared to the terror gnawing at her heart. Echo was not moving. Was he alive? Was it too late? The man worked quickly, his movements precise as if he had done this before. He placed his hand on Echo's chest, pressing down gently, trying to revive the foal. The tension in the air was thick, a silent prayer hanging over them all. After what felt like an eternity, Echo's body gave a small, shuddering breath, then another. Slowly, with the man's steady hands and Dakota's watchful presence, the foal began to stir. His eyes fluttered open, weak but alive. A surge of relief washed over Dakota, and she nuzzled her foal, licking the water from his coat. The storm still raged around them, but in that moment, it did not matter. Echo was alive. The man stepped back, watching as the mare tended to her foal. He looked up at the sky, the storm showing no signs of letting up, but his expression softened. "You are lucky," he said quietly, almost to himself, "but you will not last out here much longer." Dakota looked up at the man, her instincts telling her he was right. This storm was not going to let up anytime soon. They could not stay out here much longer. The man reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a rope, tying it securely around Echo's body. "You are going to have to trust me," he said, his voice firm yet kind. "We need to get you to safety, and fast." Dakota hesitated, the protective instincts that had served her well throughout her life clashing with the need for survival. But she looked down at her foal, his eyes still weak but filled with gratitude, and she knew she had no choice. With a deep breath, Dakota nodded. Together, the man, the mare, and her foal would face the storm, each step a desperate battle against the elements and time itself. The wind howled through the trees as the man guided his horse, with Dakota trotting closely behind, her foal tied securely to the rope. The storm was relentless, a powerful force that showed no mercy to the travelers. Snow and ice whipped across the landscape, the horizon barely visible through the swirling mass of white. Despite the raging storm, Dakota stayed close, her instincts keeping her at the man's side. The weight of her foal's survival pressed heavily on her heart. Echo had begun to regain his strength, but he was still fragile, his legs unsteady from the cold and the trauma of his near drowning. Dakota's protective instincts were on full alert. She watched over him, nudging him gently with her muzzle whenever he faltered. The man rode ahead, his eyes focused on the path before him. His dark horse plodded through the snow, its hooves crunching on the frozen earth, each step slow but steady. The man's face was grim, his eyes scanning the storm, searching for any sign of shelter. He had no intention of stopping until he found somewhere safe for the foal and the mare. Dakota's heart raced as she followed. Her legs burned from the effort. She was not used to being led by a stranger, especially not one who had appeared so suddenly in her life. But in the absence of a better choice, she trusted him. He had saved Echo's life when all seemed lost. He was their only hope now. The man spoke over his shoulder, his voice barely audible above the storm. "We are close. Just a little further." Dakota pushed forward, her hooves slipping on the ice, but she kept moving. She could feel the tension in the air. The storm was growing stronger, and time was running out. She glanced over at Echo, who had fallen behind. His small body struggled to keep up. The foal was exhausted, each step a monumental effort. His breathing was shallow, his little body trembling with the cold. She nickered softly, urging him forward, but he stumbled, his legs giving way beneath him once again. Dakota immediately rushed to his side, nudging him gently to get him back on his feet. The foal let out a weak whinny, his eyes pleading for help. For a moment, it seemed as though the storm might swallow them whole. The man reined in his horse, turning back toward them. "You are not going to make it at this pace," he said, his tone steady but urgent. He dismounted quickly and came to Dakota's side, his hand outstretched toward Echo. Dakota hesitated, her protective instincts flaring up. She was not sure if she could trust him fully, this man who had appeared out of nowhere, saving them from the lake. But she looked down at her foal, who was struggling to stand, his little body shivering uncontrollably. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes. With a heavy heart, she stepped aside, allowing the man to take the foal into his arms. Echo let out a weak, almost helpless sound, but he did not fight. He was too tired, too cold, to resist. The man cradled him gently, wrapping him in his thick cloak. For the first time, Dakota allowed herself to breathe a little easier. "Hold on, little one," the man murmured, his voice low and comforting as he rocked the foal in his arms. Dakota stayed close, her eyes never leaving her son as they continued their trek through the storm. She followed closely behind, her mind racing with questions. Who was this man? Where was he taking them? Was it really safe? Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and the world seemed to narrow around them. The storm, the cold, the snow, they all seemed so vast, so endless. Yet somewhere in the distance, the man's horse began to pick up speed. The horse's hooves cut through the snow faster now. The man's gaze never faltered, his eyes scanning the white wasteland ahead, as if searching for something only he could see. And then, through the storm, there it was, a cabin, small but sturdy, nestled against the side of a mountain. The smoke from a chimney rose into the sky, faint but unmistakable. A flicker of light could be seen through the frost-covered windows. It was a haven, a place of safety in the middle of the unforgiving wilderness. The man's expression softened, and he gave a quick nod. "We are almost there," he said, more to himself than to Dakota. "Are we going to make it?" Dakota's heart swelled with relief, but the journey was not over. The storm was still fierce, and they were running out of time. Her foal needed warmth, food, shelter, and above all, he needed to rest. She pushed forward with renewed determination, her body aching but driven by the desperate need to reach the shelter before it was too late. The man's horse reached the cabin first, and the man dismounted swiftly, still holding Echo in his arms. He moved quickly, pulling open the door to the cabin with one swift motion, and stepping inside. Dakota followed closely behind, her heart pounding in her chest. The warmth inside the cabin hit her like a wave, and she immediately felt the tension in her muscles begin to ease. The man set Echo down on a pile of blankets in front of a roaring fire, his body still shivering from the cold, but his expression focused as he worked quickly. "Stay here," he instructed, turning to Dakota. "I will make sure he is all right." Dakota watched as the man began to tend to Echo, wrapping him in more blankets and feeding him warm liquid to help revive his strength. She nickered softly, still unsure of the stranger but deeply grateful for the safety he had provided. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to relax inside the warmth of the cabin. The storm howled outside, but Dakota and Echo were safe, at least for the moment. The fire crackled in the hearth, its flames casting a soft glow on the wooden walls. The smell of dry wood and freshly brewed tea filled the air. The man worked tirelessly, ensuring Echo's small body was tucked under layers of blankets, a bowl of warm broth resting beside him. Dakota stood by the fire, her coat steaming from the heat, but her eyes never left her foal. She was too anxious to rest. She had watched Echo slip under the ice, heard his desperate cries, and felt the weight of the fear that had gripped her heart. When he did not move, Dakota's heart raced with worry. But now he was breathing, and his small form was slowly beginning to warm. The man glanced over at Dakota, his brow furrowed with concern. "You are doing the right thing by staying close to him," he said, his voice soft. "The bond between a mother and her foal is powerful. You have been his strength. He needs you now more than ever." Dakota nickered in response, moving closer to her foal. She lowered her head to gently nudge him, her eyes filled with tenderness and quiet worry. Echo's eyes were closed, and he still shivered slightly despite the warmth of the blankets. The man observed them both for a moment before he sighed, wiping his brow. He walked over to the table, pulling out a bundle of dried herbs from his pack. "You have been through a lot, both of you. But you need rest," he said, looking back at Dakota. Her ears flicked in irritation. Rest? She could not rest, not while her foal was still so fragile. She would never leave him alone. The storm outside could have raged forever, and she still would not have left his side. But before she could protest, Echo's eyes fluttered open, weak but alert. He let out a soft, hoarse whinny. Dakota immediately lowered her head to nuzzle him, the urgency in her touch clear. She could see the light returning to his eyes, though his body was still stiff from the cold. It was not enough yet. He was alive, but still so weak. She could not allow herself to relax. Not yet. The man, seeing the foal's struggle, stepped forward cautiously. He reached into his bag again, pulling out a small vial of something dark and thick. "Here," he said, his voice low. "This will help. A little more warmth inside him will go a long way." Dakota did not understand all of it, but the man's actions were gentle, and Echo accepted the drink without protest. He made a small sound of discomfort at first, but as the warmth of the liquid began to spread through his body, his shivering began to subside. For a few moments, there was silence, only the crackling of the fire and the soft sound of Echo's breathing filling the cabin. But then, just as Dakota was starting to feel a bit of peace wash over her, the man spoke again, his voice grave. "You are going to need more than just rest," he said, his tone serious. "The storm is not letting up anytime soon. It is only going to get worse." Dakota's heart sank at his words. She had been so focused on keeping Echo alive, on making sure he could breathe and feel warmth again, that she had not stopped to consider the bigger picture. The storm was fierce, and they could not afford to wait around in a place that was not truly safe. They needed to get out soon. "What do you mean?" she finally asked, her voice low but laced with anxiety. The man turned toward the window, glancing out at the swirling blizzard. "I mean that we are trapped here for now. The snow has piled up so high out there that we cannot go anywhere in this weather. We are stuck, and that means we are running out of time to find proper shelter for you and your foal." Dakota stared at him, her mind racing. What did this mean for them? What if they could not leave in time? What if Echo did not get strong enough? A cold shiver ran down her spine as she thought about the alternative. She had seen what the storm could do, what it had already done to Echo. She was not ready to risk losing him, not after everything they had been through. The man could see the fear in her eyes. He softened his expression and walked over to her, placing a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder. "Do not worry," he said reassuringly. "We will make it through this. You and your foal are strong. You have survived the worst of it already." His words were meant to comfort her, but they did not completely ease the weight pressing down on her chest. The storm was getting worse, and even though they had found refuge for now, Dakota knew the danger was not over. Echo let out a small cough, his tiny body still shivering under the blankets. Dakota moved to him immediately, pressing her warm body against his for extra comfort. She had never been more grateful for the warmth of the fire and the shelter they had found, but it still was not enough. There was a long, silent pause before the man spoke again, his voice solemn. "Listen, I have seen storms like this before. We will have to stay put for now, but we need to keep the fire going and do everything we can to help your foal recover. We will need to ride out when we can, but it might not be tomorrow or the next day. It could be longer." Dakota nodded, her eyes fixed on Echo, and she nickered softly to him, reassuring him. The foal weakly raised his head, blinking up at her. For a brief moment, she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of hope. She was not going to let him down. She would do whatever it took to get them both through this storm. The man looked at her one last time, giving a nod of understanding. "I will help you both. We will get through this together," he said. But deep down, Dakota knew their fight was far from over. The worst might be behind them, but the journey ahead would prove just as challenging. The storm had only just begun. The storm raged through the night, its icy winds battering against the walls of the small cabin. Outside, the world was a blur of white. The snow continued to fall relentlessly, suffocating the landscape beneath a blanket of cold and chaos. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled and popped, but even the warmth it provided could not lift the tension that gripped the space. Dakota stood by the window, her dark eyes scanning the storm. Every now and then, she would turn toward Echo, her foal, who lay resting under a mound of blankets near the hearth. His breathing had steadied over the course of the night, but he was still fragile. She could feel the weight of his vulnerability in the air, as though the storm itself was trying to take him away. The man was busy near the fire, his back turned to the window. He had been feeding Echo small doses of herbal remedies and warm liquids, but even his steady hands could not ease the worry that gnawed at him. Despite his calm demeanor, it was clear he was concerned. He had mentioned the storm earlier, but now, as the hours passed and the weather showed no signs of relenting, the danger was becoming more real. "It is too quiet," the man muttered to himself, pacing across the room. "Too still." Dakota perked up, her ears flicking forward. She could sense the tension in his voice. She was not sure if she fully understood the man's words, but his unease was unmistakable. The calm before the storm was always the most dangerous. She moved closer to Echo, nudging him gently to check on his condition. He was still too weak to stand, but his eyes were open now, his gaze following her every movement. His small body was warm, but his muscles trembled slightly, as though he was struggling to stay strong. Dakota nickered softly, her head lowering to his side, offering him what little comfort she could. He let out a faint, almost imperceptible whinny in response, and her heart swelled with a deep sense of love and protectiveness. The man turned to look at them, and for a moment, his expression softened. "You are doing everything you can for him," he said quietly. "He is lucky to have a mother like you." Dakota was not sure how to respond, but she gave a soft whinny in acknowledgement, grateful for the man's support, even if she still was not sure if she trusted him entirely. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the howling winds now mixed with strange noises. Twigs snapping, the groan of trees bending under the pressure of the snow. The man walked to the door and peered out, his eyes narrowing against the swirling wind. "We are not safe here," he said suddenly, turning back to Dakota. His voice was firm, a stark contrast to the unease he had shown before. "There is something out there." Dakota's heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. The air felt charged with a strange energy, and she could not shake the sense that danger was drawing near. The man grabbed his coat, slinging it over his shoulders, his face set in grim determination. "I have to go," he said, his tone brokering no argument. "Stay with your foal. Keep him safe." He moved toward the door, but before he could open it, there was a loud bang. The door shook under the force of something slamming against it. Dakota's muscles tensed, and she took a cautious step back. The man's hand hovered over the handle, and he hesitated for a moment. Then he swung the door open just enough to peek outside. The storm, once deafening, seemed to grow even more intense. The wind howled, but this time there was something else, an eerie growl, deep and guttural, coming from the shadows of the trees. The man's face went pale. "It is too late," he murmured under his breath. Dakota's heart raced. She could not see what was out there, but the growl sent a chill through her. She moved closer to Echo, instinctively trying to shield him with her own body. He let out a weak whimper, and she pressed her side against his, offering him whatever comfort she could. The man stepped outside, his figure swallowed by the storm. Dakota's ears flicked back as she glanced nervously toward the door. Every fiber of her being told her to stay by her foal, to protect him from whatever was out there. But her instincts also told her that something far more dangerous was approaching. The growl grew louder, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to echo through the trees. Dakota's heart pounded in her chest, and she pawed at the ground nervously. Was it a predator? Was it something larger, something she could not fight off alone? She glanced back at Echo, her thoughts racing. If anything happened to the man, how would they survive? A shape appeared in the distance, large and looming, moving through the snow with surprising speed. Dakota's breath caught in her throat. It was too big to be a wolf, too powerful to be just an ordinary creature. The shape grew larger, and soon she could see its features, a massive shadowy figure like a wild beast from the deepest forests. Its eyes glowed faintly in the storm. It was a bear. Dakota's heart stopped. The massive animal was heading straight for the cabin, its growls becoming louder, more ferocious. She stood still for a moment, frozen in fear. Echo was too weak to run. She was the only one who could protect him now, but she was no match for a bear. The bear's massive silhouette loomed in the swirling snow outside, its growls low and ominous, growing louder as it approached the cabin. Dakota's heart pounded in her chest, her every instinct screaming at her to protect her foal. She could feel the warmth of Echo's small body against hers, the rhythmic rise and fall of his breath. Still weak, still fragile, but alive. That was all that mattered. She glanced toward the door where the man had stepped outside, his voice barely audible in the storm. What was he thinking? What could he possibly do against something so powerful? Panic surged within her, but she could not move. She could not leave her foal alone. The growl grew closer, the ground beneath Dakota's hooves shaking with each heavy step the bear took. She took a step back, her body tense, but her gaze never left the door. Her instincts told her to stand strong, to defend her foal, but she was only a horse. What could she do? Echo stirred beside her, his weak body trying to rise, his eyes wide, panic evident in them. Dakota nickered softly, nudging him back down with her muzzle, trying to reassure him. He was still too young, too fragile to understand the danger that was closing in. She had to keep him safe. That was her only thought now. The door to the cabin creaked open, and the man stepped inside, his face pale and full of concern. He moved quickly toward Dakota, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Echo. "We must leave," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "The bear is getting too close. We will not survive this storm if we stay here." Dakota turned her head toward him, her eyes filled with confusion. Leave? Where would they go? The storm outside was merciless. The snow piled high against the walls of the cabin. There was nowhere to go but into the wilderness, and she could not risk Echo's fragile state. She could barely keep him warm, let alone navigate through the treacherous conditions outside. But the man was right about one thing. They could not stay here. The bear was not going to just leave. It was hungry, desperate, and the scent of life inside the cabin had drawn it in. Dakota had no idea how long they could survive in these conditions, how long they could survive against this wild threat. Her hooves scraped the floor nervously as she moved closer to Echo, blocking him from view. Her protective instincts were on overdrive. She would fight for him. She would fight with everything she had. The man grabbed a rope from his pack, tying it around his waist and securing it to a post near the door. "We need to leave now," he repeated, his voice growing more urgent. "I will lead the way. Stay close, and we will make it." Dakota whinnied softly, uncertainty clouding her mind. She could feel the weight of Echo's small form against her, his fragile legs barely able to hold him up. How could she leave the safety of the cabin in the middle of a storm with a bear just outside? But what other choice did she have? The man moved toward the door once more, preparing to open it. The air inside was thick with tension, every breath feeling heavy with anxiety. Echo's breathing had quickened, and he pawed nervously at the ground. He was still too weak to fully understand the urgency, but he could sense the danger. He let out a soft whimper. Dakota lowered her head and gently nudged him toward the door, her heart swelling with the need to protect him. She could do this. She had to. The man opened the door just a crack, peering outside to assess the bear's distance. The storm howled in a furious crescendo, but the bear's growl was unmistakable. It was much closer now, too close. Suddenly, the man's eyes went wide. "It is here," he breathed. Dakota's heart leaped in her chest. The bear was right outside. She could see its massive shape moving through the blizzard, its glowing eyes fixed on the cabin. The man turned quickly, grabbing a bundle of hay from a corner of the cabin and throwing it toward the door in an attempt to distract the beast. But the bear's gaze never wavered. It roared, a sound that vibrated the very earth beneath Dakota's hooves, and charged toward the door. Without thinking, Dakota sprang into action. She shoved Echo backward with all her strength, pushing him behind a stack of crates near the fire. Her hooves dug into the cold wooden floor as she spun around to face the door. There was no time to think. She had to act. She was the only thing standing between her foal and the bear. Her body trembled with fear, but there was no retreat. She would not let this beast take her foal. The bear was nearly at the door now, its heavy paws pounding the snow. Dakota felt her heart hammer in her chest. This was it, the moment she would either live or die. But she would not let her foal face this alone. The man stood beside her, his eyes filled with pure determination. He had no weapons, only his strength. But together, they might have a chance. "I will hold it off as long as I can," he said through gritted teeth. "You need to get him out of here now." Dakota glanced at him, nodding once. She knew what she had to do. She had to protect Echo. She had to give him the chance to live. With a final glance at the man, Dakota turned toward the door. The bear was almost within reach. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. With one final push, she charged toward the door, her hooves pounding the ground as she prepared to face the creature that threatened everything she loved. The door creaked as it opened wider, the storm's howl filling the cabin. Dakota stood in the doorway, her body braced against the cold wind. Her eyes locked on the mass of the bear, now only a few feet away. Her heart thudded in her chest, but there was no fear in her stance, only determination. This was her moment, the moment when a mother's love would stand firm against the greatest of threats. The bear, a hulking mass of muscle and fur, let out a ferocious roar that echoed through the storm. Its yellow eyes locked on her, wild hunger in its gaze. It knew what it wanted, and it was too close for Dakota to retreat. Her foal was behind her, safe for the moment, but that would not last unless she held the line. She stood between the bear and the small shelter where Echo lay, her legs slightly apart, muscles tensed, ready to fight. Her mane whipped wildly in the wind, her body trembling from the cold, but her spirit burned hot with the fire of protection. The man moved slowly toward the bear, trying to draw its attention away from Dakota and Echo. He shouted, waving his arms to distract it, but the bear was not fooled. It had its sights set on Dakota, and nothing was going to make it change course. It lunged. Dakota was not fast enough to avoid the bear's charge, but she was quick enough to react. She sidestepped, using her powerful hind legs to deliver a sharp kick to the bear's side. The impact of her kick was enough to stagger the creature, but it only made it angrier. With a growl, the bear whipped around, slashing at her with its claws. The man screamed for her to move, but there was no way she was going to leave her foal. Dakota stood her ground, dodging the bear's swipes with a grace that came from years of survival in the wild. She was fast, but the bear was relentless. Each strike felt like thunder crashing against the earth, and every movement was a reminder of the danger that was closing in. The man rushed forward, grabbing a broken piece of wood from the ground and using it as a makeshift weapon. He swung it toward the bear's head, striking it with all his strength. The bear staggered back for a moment, growling, but it did not retreat. It was too powerful, too angry to back down now. Dakota watched the scene unfold, her mind racing. She had to protect Echo. That was all that mattered now. Her muscles burned with fatigue, but she had no choice but to fight. The man's voice was barely audible over the howling storm, but his words reached her. "Go, take him and run." Dakota's head jerked toward Echo's hiding place. He was still too weak to move on his own. She could not leave him behind, but the man was right. Their only chance was to run, to get as far from the bear as possible. With a sharp nicker, Dakota turned and charged toward the pile of crates where Echo was hiding. Her hooves dug into the snow-covered floor as she rushed to his side, nudging him gently with her nose. His small, fragile body was trembling. His eyes were wide with fear, but he did not move. He was too weak to run. Dakota lowered her head to his side, nudging him forward with all her strength. "We have to go," she whispered softly, urging him to rise. "We have to get out of here." Echo struggled to lift himself. His legs shook beneath him, but he finally managed to stand. His legs were wobbly, his body weak, but he stood, supported by Dakota's unyielding presence. She nickered softly, pushing him gently toward the door. Behind them, the man was still fighting the bear off. His every move was a desperate attempt to keep the creature at bay, but it was clear he could not hold out much longer. The bear was too powerful, too fast. Dakota could hear its growls, its claws raking against the ground, coming closer with every passing second. "Go," the man shouted one last time, his voice full of desperation. Without another thought, Dakota turned and ran. She pushed Echo ahead of her, urging him forward despite his weak legs. The snow stung her eyes. The wind whipped against her face, but there was no time to hesitate. The storm had become their enemy, but the bear was a threat they could not outrun unless they acted now. They ran through the storm, dodging snowdrifts and trees. Her hooves sank deep into the powder. Echo struggled to keep up, but Dakota was there every step of the way, guiding him, protecting him. She could hear the bear's growls fading behind them, but she did not dare look back. She could not stop, not until they were safe. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small ridge, a narrow path that led down toward the river. The storm still raged around them, but they had managed to put distance between themselves and the bear. Dakota's muscles burned with exhaustion, but she could not afford to stop. Not yet. Echo let out a weak whinny, his head hanging low. He was struggling, but he was still with her. That was all that mattered. They continued onward, moving slowly now as the storm began to lose its intensity. The wind had died down, the snow no longer falling in thick, suffocating sheets. They had made it. By some miracle, they had made it out of the worst of the storm. As they crested the final hill, the man appeared beside them. His face was bloodied and bruised, but his eyes were filled with relief. He had made it. He had kept them safe. The three of them, Dakota, Echo, and the man, stood together at the edge of the frozen river, watching as the storm finally began to subside. The danger had passed, but the bond between them was forever changed. They had survived together. Dakota nuzzled Echo, her heart swelling with pride and love. Against all odds, they had made it through. They had faced the wildest of challenges, and in the end, it was their courage and determination that had carried them through. As the last remnants of the storm faded, Dakota looked out over the horizon, her heart at peace. They were safe, for now, and that was enough. Dakota and Echo's journey proves that no storm, no matter how fierce, can break the bond of love and courage. Their story is a testament to the power of perseverance and the unbreakable spirit of a mother's protection. If this story touched your heart, do not forget to subscribe, like, and share it with someone who believes in the strength of love and the courage to overcome any obstacle. Stay tuned for more inspiring tales.